Firstly, it's free text, which is sort of bad news if you want to get a computer to work on it. Secondly, as you might have noticed, it's in Danish, because it's from Danish hospitals, and a lot of these different vocabularies and so on, Medra, things like that you might want to work with, they actually haven't been translated to Danish. That makes our life harder. Then, of course, it's using complex terminology, medical terminology, is written by busy doctors, which means that unlike doing text mining on, say, biomedical articles, you're going to have text that is full of abbreviations, full of typos, misspellings, things like that. Which is not to blame the doctors, it's just what is more important, to fix your typo in the text or go see the next patient. Well, go see the next patient. And there's a lot of it. So what we were working on for added fun, this is for the data we could get access to the fastest, was data from a psychiatric hospital. So you have these psychiatrist interviews. Some of those are really long. There are actually some patients where the total amount of text we have from all of these nursing notes and doctors' notes and psychiatrist interviews, you get into the point where the text of one patient is like Lord of the Rings, the trilogy. and it's sad reading. So we really need to get a computer to work on this text and read it for us. And whenever I need to get a computer to do something that even halfway approaches being smart, such as reading text meant for medical doctors, I get slightly worried, and I find it useful to think of the analogy that a computer is about as smart as a dog. And by that I mean that if I put sufficient effort into training it, I can teach it to do specific tricks. And borrowing a cartoon, what we say to dogs, okay, Ginger, I've had it. You stay out of the garbage. Understand, Ginger? Stay out of the garbage or else. And what the dog hears is blah, blah, Ginger, blah, 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 Ginger, blah, blah, blah. And this is sort of roughly my level of ambition. Not that the computer recognizes its own name, but that the computer recognizes names of stuff being mentioned in the text, but fully well accepting that most of the text will be blah, blah, blah to the computer. It will not know what most of the words mean. This is what people in text mining like to call named entity recognition, or NER for short. They love making up complicated terms for simple things. If you think about this for a second, it means nothing but recognizing stuff with names. And unsurprisingly, if you want to recognize stuff with names, the key component is to have a good comprehensive dictionary of the names you want to recognize. In our case, that would be things like diseases, drugs, adverse drug reactions. We want to find those in the text. We of course need to know the synonyms. We need to know these names are different names for the same thing. And we need to handle what the text mining people call orthographic variation, which is the complicated way of saying that things might be written in slightly different ways, like in one word or two words or with a hyphen. And then we need some flexible matching to handle that, as well as some expansion to handle various other variation. There will be things like spelling variants. If you were doing it here, it could be things like British spelling versus American spelling. It could also be things like doctors not being able to spell. This is a drug. This is all the ways they stole from this one hospital. That's at one hospital with about 6,000 patients. They managed to spell this drug in all these different ways, which is kind of entertaining. Yes. None of the other variants are actual real drug names. You get the distinct feeling that they know how it's pronounced, but they're not quite clear on how exactly you spell it. So what we're doing is actually some sort of phonetic expansion, that we have the drug names, and then we know how it would be pronounced, and then we generate variant names that would be pronounced roughly the same. So often you have this thing like an E at the end that might be a silent E, so they might have it or not have it. You know, C and K is pronounced, C, K, CH, that's all going to be pronounced roughly the same. Other variants that we'll be generating that didn't actually happen for this one, obviously, would be things like F, double F, PH, pronounced all the same. Yes?
The soundex, the systemology, how we call that?
It probably would. it's not what we did just for technical reasons, the way we're doing the matching, but that would do largely the same. What we did was something very similar.
Yeah.
I mean, it's inspired. We were sort of doing that in reverse. Instead of mapping everything to the soundtext space and then doing the matching there, we're kind of taking everything and then we're expanding it with the variants that according to soundtext would map to the same. End result is the same. And we can also do some approximate matching, allowing one letter difference and things like that. But there's a lot of things you can do to match this. But it's kind of fun, especially drug names, they're really bad. Last but not least, you need a blacklist. And a blacklist are the list of names that you have in your dictionary, not because your dictionary is wrong, but which tend to cause disasters when you do text mining. So I don't know how many of you are sort of familiar with working on proteins, but when we're working with, for example, recognizing gene and protein names, there's a human gene for which the recommended Q protein symbol is SDS. SDS is also a detergent that you use to stop proteins. So you can imagine how great it's going to be if you do text mining of the protein literature and you think they talk about the SDS gene whenever they write SDS. My favorite example from text mining Danish records is this one. Danish, pest eller kolera. Pest means the plague. Kolera means cholera. Eller means all. We're talking about a psychiatric hospital here. You can sort of imagine how many plague victims and cholera victims we have at a psychiatric hospital, right? Clearly something is wrong. What's going on? Well, it turns out this is a common expression in Danish. It means having to choose between two evils. So, for example, when you're interviewing these psychiatric patients about having to choose between taking a certain drug that treats their symptoms but causes bad adverse drug reactions versus living with the symptoms and not taking the medicine, they might use this phrase to describe it. So, of course, if you try to do comorbidity or things like that based on the text mining, you're going to find that plague is very strongly correlated with cholera in this hospital. You want to block this. So, what are we trying to do with this? Fun aside. What we really try to do primarily is to do pharmacovigilance. So you're probably familiar with that when you do drug development, the main way you learn about adverse drug reactions is through clinical trials. So you have these clinical trials, and then after you put the drug to market, you need to do post-market monitoring, which usually happens through a spontaneous reporting system. And when you do this spontaneous reporting, you are filling in a form that looks something like this. Does this look like fun to you? That probably explains how often the doctors fill it out. There's an enormous underreporting problem. Most of the time when adverse drug reactions happen to patients, if it's not something so severe that it cannot be ignored, it will not be reported. So we were thinking, well, we have some stuff here, right? Could we do some text and data mining on it? Because what have we got? We've got structured information about the medication, so we know which patients receive which drugs when. We have all these adverse events that happen to patients that are hopefully described in this text, which is also labeled with patient ID and timestamp. We should be able to do some sort of handcrafted rules, temporal correlations to link things. So here we're looking at a patient. That patient starts getting some drug on this date, starts getting the drug on this date, and then in between we see other some adverse events mentioned in the text. The first thing we do is we discard the first day. Firstly, it's pretty unlikely that a drug causes adverse drug reactions that happen the same day that you start taking the drug, and we don't know about them. You would surely have discovered that. Secondly, you're going to get a lot of false positives, because there's often this phrase that when the doctor starts prescribing a new drug to the patient, there might be the section where the text then goes, I have informed the patient that he or she may experience this and that 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 adverse drug reaction. All the ones it says in the box, right? They haven't actually happened. So by far the easiest way of filtering those out is by just ignoring the first day. The next thing we do is we have a number of other filter rules. What we call negative modifiers, which could be things as simple as negations. If the text says something did not happen, you should not interpret it as that it happened. Other things that we filter out is mentions of other family members. So it could be that this sentence or paragraph is actually not talking about the patient, but about the brother of the patient or the mother of the patient and so on. So anything that mentions mother, father, brother, sister, cousin, anything like that, we know. Then we go on and filter out indications, because the problem here when you do the name identity recognition is there's a huge overlap between diseases and adverse drug reactions. The indication of one drug can easily be the adverse drug reaction of another drug. There are plenty of drugs that cause headache and nausea, and sometimes patients actually then get a second drug to treat the adverse drug reaction of the first drug. That's quite common. So you need to somehow filter that out, because obviously a drug is likely to be mentioned together with the indication that is the reason why the patient got the drug. But we don't want to do fancy data and text mining to come up with a conclusion that aspirin causes headache. So we filter out the indication. We also filter out known adverse drug reactions of other drugs. That's particularly a problem for these psychiatric patients who very commonly are on multiple drugs at the same time. We don't want to go out and propose that this drug causes an unknown adverse drug reaction when this adverse drug reaction happened to a patient who's at the same time on another drug that is known to cause that adverse drug reaction. Yes?
So you mentioned that you know the first days.
The first day, yes.
So that means then that for drugs that cause things like anaphylactic shock, they will not be suitable to.
Sure. The thing is exactly that if we're trying to discover the things people have overlooked. And the simple logic we have is we may be able to discover a lot of things that are correct, but there will be no. If you give some medication and immediately something anaphylactic shock happens to the patient, you will not be in doubt that it was because of that drug. So that would surely be reported and be known. We're trying to discover the unknown ones, which are all the things that patients start taking a drug and then several weeks or months later you start having bad things happen. That's the stuff that could be overlooked, especially when you're looking at patients who are on multiple drugs at the same time, so you have no idea what drug actually caused it, the individual patient.
It seems to me that the people who use these discharge diagnosis data should know the back end, what happens, what you do, for example, how you handle the issue.
Well, I mean, that's not why they're generating it. Right? I mean, they're not generating it for our sake. So they wouldn't be adjusting how they're doing things, if that's what you mean.
No, I mean that some of the things you do, which you exclude, for example, I mean, if I don't know when I use discharge diagnosis, I just would not know it. But and yet,
sure,
that's part of your screening.
Sure, I mean, firstly, what we're doing here is not something that is in production in any way. It's a proof of concept done at one hospital to see whether we can discover adverse drug reactions that way. If one started putting it into production and actually using it in a medical setting, then one would need to start worrying about those things. And I mean, the clearest thing would just be to, for example, I still don't understand why they're actually writing the section that they informed the patient about that every possible adverse drug reaction might happen. I don't, it's probably some legal reason, I don't know. We would filter it out. So getting back, the other thing we filter out is pre-existing conditions. So we're looking at the same patient before they started taking the drug. Say, did the same adverse event already happen to them before they started taking this drug? Because if it did, there's not really a particular reason to think that it's happening again is now substitute to the drug. And then we're left with the adverse events that we think might have something to do with the drug, and we do statistics across lots of patients, and we compare it to what's known to see if we just rediscover a known adverse drug reaction of the drug, or if we find something that is possibly a new adverse drug reaction that was not known about. And of course, we're happy to see we can recall a lot of the known adverse drug reactions. We can also estimate the frequencies with which they happen. So we can say for how large a percentage of patients who are on drug X, how large a percentage of them experience a certain adverse drug reaction. We can compare that to what we found in clinical trials. We see pretty nice correlation that here is the frequency we see in our cohort, this small hospital, and here are these frequency categories that are typically used in the clinical trials, like it's common and infrequent and whatever. So more than 1 in 10, between 1 in 10 and 1 in 100, and between 1 in 100 and 1 in 1,000. And we see it correlates all the way you would expect. You see, for the very frequent ones, we seem to a little bit underestimate the frequency with which it happens. I'm guessing that down to that if it's so common, then since the drug actually got approved, I guess it's not something particularly severe. So even the doctors and nurses in just the clinical narrative might not bother writing it all the time. The ones in the mid-interval, we're pretty much spot on. These ones, the more infrequent ones, we overestimate the frequency. That's basically down to the cohort being too small. We're looking at 6,000 people. If you're looking at a specific drug, you're going to have maybe a few hundred people. So you're trying to estimate a frequency that is in the range of 1 in 100 to 1 in 1,000 patients, less than 1,000 people. That basically means that you might overestimate the frequency if it happens once. And what's missing in the plot is, of course, all the ones that happen 0 times, because those we didn't discover. Lastly, we can discover new adverse drug reactions. We didn't discover something that was sort of shocking or anything like that, but we did discover a bunch of things that are to be expected and seem sensible. It's very hard to actually define what new means in this context. So sometimes something is not listed as a known adverse drug reaction on the information sheets in Europe, but it's listed in the US. Sometimes it's neither listed in Europe nor in the US, but if you just go do a quick PubMed search for that adverse drug reaction, that drug is reported in the literature. At which point do you call it new? We find things that it's not listed in Europe, it's not listed in the US, it's not listed in the literature, but actually it's a known adverse drug reaction of several other drugs very similar to the one we're looking at. So you have chemically very similar compounds with the same mode of action, and the adverse drug reaction is known for the other ones. It's highly likely it also happens for this one. So it looks promising in terms of being able to actually do this. Of course, if you want to get statistical power and do this for a much broader range of drugs, be able to discover adverse drug reactions quickly in post-market monitoring, you should obviously do this systematically on a much larger cohort of patients across many more hospitals and do it real time. We just did it as a one-off analysis on a hospital with 6,000 patients to prove that it's possible to do. And I think it would be worthwhile doing that on patients, but we haven't done that. So with that, I just want to acknowledge the people who actually did all the work, so I can travel around to nice places and give talks and join day for Thanksgiving. And that would be the text mining on the electronic health side, which really was started by Peter Jensen, the former PhD student in Søren Brunek's group. All the work on text mining adverse drug reactions was really the work of another very talented PhD student called Body Eriksson, also in Søren's group. The work on disease trajectories was primarily done by Peter Jensen, together with, among others, a guy you know. And all of this was collaborations with Søren. It was also a very strong collaboration with Thomas Verro, one of the senior medical doctors at the psychiatric hospital. It's really key to work with the people at the individual hospitals. There are mysterious things in the patient records that you can never figure out what it means unless you talk to them. So there are people in our groups who are medical doctors and they don't understand what the medical records mean. You need to talk to the people at the individual hospital. Like we had a lot of entries that would end on stuff like T dot name of some drug, T dot name of another drug, T dot name of another drug. We're like, well, what does this mean? T dot. We're like, oh, it's one tablet of that, one tablet of that, one tablet of that. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. So we really need to talk to those people. Of course, funding as well from the Novo Nordisk Foundation Center for Protein Research. So we have a lot of funding from Novo Nordisk Fund. This research was also funded by the Seventh Framework EU program from the Danish Agency for Science, Technology and Innovation and Great Fund. And thanks for your attention.
So we've done a good job of asking questions throughout, but now's
the official question and answer period. So,
what is the sensitivity and specificity of your approach in discovering drugs?
It's very, very hard to say. Because the point is, there's of course an enormous number of known adverse drug reactions that we don't find when we're looking at a tiny cohort like that. Especially for drugs that are not psychiatric drugs, which means that you're going to have a lot of drugs that were maybe given to 10 patients at the hospital. And of course, for those, we wouldn't be incapable statistically of finding any significant adverse drug reactions. So you can't really estimate how well this approach would work without applying it to many, many more patients. The specificity, hard to say. It seems good in the sense that the vast majority of the associations we find are adverse drug reactions that are known for that drug. So the fact that most of the associations we find are not things where we come out and propose novel stuff, but the vast majority of what we find is things that were also found in clinical trials, suggests that the specificity is good.
So are you doing some kind of research on the adverse reactions or doing some kind of semantic relationships? Because you mentioned that you ignore if you have a father-mother relationships. So how do you link the adverse reaction to the context that comes before or after in your approach?
So what we were doing was very simplistically just looking at the same sentences, when it was the same paragraph. So same paragraph, that if that was mentioning other family members or something, it was not safe to assume that whatever was being said was about the patient. So that was just filtering blocks of text to say this block of text might actually not be about something that happened to the patient. We also have many other fun things than just family members. Since it's a psychiatric hospital, then you have patients who suffer from delusions of something happening. You have patients who tell their psychiatrist that they saw a TV show yesterday about something. You have all those kinds of things. You know, one of the very frequent diagnoses when you text mine for diseases in this text is that you find AIDS, HIV, all the time. And of course, there are some people who are at that hospital because of drug abuse, which cause psychiatric problems, and some of those, very few of them, might have HIV. That's not the reason why it's mentioned so much. The reason is that from the time period that we're looking at, there was a period where all the people at the psychiatric hospital were incredibly scared of HIV, so they were talking about it all the time. They didn't have it. So you really need those filters in the text.
Yes. Pretty detailed question. We talked yesterday a little bit about dictionaries and how you got those together. I'm wondering, the information about the adverse events of the other drugs that the same patient takes, how do you get that in? Is that part of your dictionary? Do you need to link that manually?
So that was done separately based on other data. So that was based on what we talked about, which was text mining of the adverse drug reaction information on the drug information sheets. So what we were filtering for was we had an structured form in the database, of course, all the medication of all the patients. So we knew which were which drugs. And then what we looked up for those was not based on text mining the health records, but rather just text mining the ATR sections on the drug sheets to say, okay, this patient is also on that drug, which is known to cause so-and-so adverse drug reaction, so there's really no reason to think that it's due to this other drug that is not known to cause.
Do you find that you do better for certain diseases like cancer versus others like arthritis or cardiovascular?
And we can't say because we only did it at a psychiatric hospital. So we only have one class of diseases. Because whenever you, of course, other diseases happen to the psychiatric patients while they're at the hospital, but at too low frequency to have any statistics on it. I mean, if you look at the at cardiovascular diseases at a psychiatric hospital with 6,000 people, you're going to have a fairly small number of people who have cardiovascular diseases, and then for any given drug that they may be receiving for that, you would just have way too few to be able to do anything on ADRs. So that's our problem. To do this and say what it works better for, we need data on a much more diverse set of patients. The nice thing here was, of course, we could actually do something on some drugs because it was a bit of a homogeneous cohort. So it's a fairly small cohort, only 6,000 patients, but since they're all psychiatric patients, then for the classes of drugs that you use for treating those patients, we have enough patients on each drug that we can actually do something. But I would love to apply it to more diverse cohorts. The problem is getting the data.
Just to follow up on that point, so you had a tremendous amount of text because of the Lord of the Rings phenomenon being a psychiatric hospital. If I was thinking of, to your point, in a cancer institute, I wouldn't necessarily have that much free text in mine. I would have nursing notes and physician's notes, but not that many examples. Maybe radiology reports or that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So
I think it will be quite field specific. I mean, it's also clear that it's much easier to do this for something where you're looking at a cohort of patients who are inpatients. Because a lot of these adverse drug events that are recorded, they get recorded by the nurses when they're going around and talking to the patients, and the patients are not feeling well. But if you go to the hospital and then, I mean, if you're on chemotherapy, you go to the hospital and you get your treatment and you're sent home, then you might be feeling terrible, but there's no nurse who's going to write it down because you're at home.
Well, I guess I was just, my point was, how much text do you need to be able to reliably identify the kind of relationships you're looking for? I mean, is it
I think
depending
it's not so
on
much about the amount of text, it's about having the right text.
Yeah.
So that's the thing. And I mean, especially something like nursing notes are the more useful ones because they are more likely to write down these various things that happen to the patient that might not be directly attributable to anything. So if you're not looking at a group of inpatients where you actually have the nurses going around and writing some notes and stuff, I think this would work a lot less well. So it really, for the diseases where most patients would be outpatients, for example, I don't see this working. Again, it depends entirely on what they're doing. If it's outpatients and the doctors interview the patients about these kinds of things like adverse drug reactions, we will have it. If they don't ask the patients about it, we wouldn't have it.
Yeah, one more question. You mentioned the example of clozapine and a variation it was in the notes. How did you generate that list of blacklist of different?
Well, the list of alternative names.
Yes. I mean, did you have like a first one where you did trigger words, approximations? What kind of?
Yeah, we did a number of different things. So one was this phonetic expansion, and the other was approximate matching of the text to generate huge candidates. So what we do is basically the text mining approach we have, the software, the way it's coded, the speed doesn't depend on how big the dictionary is. So we are kind of free to blow the dictionary with potential variants that don't happen. So we can sort of explode our dictionary in the sense and generate all the possible ways that they might misspell it. And then you match that against and you see which ones actually happen. So that's what we do. So it's thanks to the algorithm we're using, we're free to blow up the dictionary and make 100 variants of everything if we want to.
So you're just looking at the you didn't take into account the dose of the drug, just identifying the drug.
We did look a little bit into the dose. For most things, it was hard to do, but we did do some analysis where, for example, I can't remember which class of drugs it was, but we had a class of drugs where we have a number of drugs that all work roughly the same way. But of course, you need different dosage because it's not the same active substance. So we sort of converted everything into equivalent dose in one drug. And then we could look at what's the frequency of adverse reactions in patients as function of the dose they get. And we saw what you would expect, that patients on higher dosage would get more adverse drug reactions. We also looked at things like how many different drugs are people on. And as expected, you see the people who are on many different, a huge drug cocktail of all kinds of stuff at the same time generally experience more adverse drug reactions. But it's a little bit difficult to say whether that's meaningful because when you're looking at people getting higher dosage or getting a complex drug cocktail. It's also indicative of them just being more sick.
Yeah. Well, that's, sorry, just to follow up on that. So looking at drug-induced liver injury, you can't tell when patients are self-administering over-the-counter drugs like acetaminophen, sometimes chronically, which is a confound that you can't see.
Absolutely. I mean, that's where, and I mean, we also have all these problems with compliance of whether people actually take the drugs. In this case, we're kind of lucky that because it's this psychiatric hospital and we're looking at a group of patients who are generally hospitalized for a period of time, we can be reasonably sure that they actually took the drugs they were supposed to take and didn't take other stuff. But that's not going to be the general case.
Other questions?
Is Denmark unique among the Scandinavian countries with regards to confidentiality and access to data, or they all similar that need you to expand?
They are similar but not identical.
Expand the data.
So you can do things in Sweden, for example, but I think they don't have one central place. They have a couple of places where it's distributed, so it's a little bit more difficult. What's more the problem is that it's hard to do it across countries because typically all of the countries, including Denmark, don't really allow you to take this highly sensitive data out of their country. So the Danish data can't leave Denmark, and the Swedish data can't leave Sweden. And the US data can't leave the US.
Even if it's de-identified.
You can't de-identify it.
And VA data can't leave the VA.
So that's really the especially text. When you have free text, it's not possible to guarantee that you de-identify it. Also, if you have the detailed hospitalization record, if I know that you went to that hospital on that day, that hospital on that day, I can probably uniquely identify you in the data set because nobody else went to those two exact hospitals in those two exact dates. So really de-identifying people, making it anonymous is in practice impossible.
And point of clarification, can you describe, because most people don't know how the Danish CPR number works. From that, you could get their age and also the gender.
Oh yeah, but we could replace that. So I mean, yeah, so the way the number is, it's not exactly a secret. The first 6 digits is your birthday. And then the next 4 digits is the one that makes it unique for you. But until recently, the way it worked was actually that one of them was a checksum, so then you're really down to 3 digits. And then depending on whether it was even or odd, would tell you a gender. So then you're really down to 500, to a very low number of different numbers. So guessing somebody's CPR number was not terrible. But of course, we could replace that with completely random numbers that would just be unique patient identifiers across the tables, and that would be done. But still, if you have the detailed information of who went where when, you can always uniquely nail down that must be that person. And even, yeah, the only thing we can distribute is once it's summary information, when it's not about individual patients. You know, if you're looking at how frequently people who get this diagnosis, how often do they get this other diagnosis within 3 months or whatever? When it's summary statistics like that, or the age and gender distribution of people given a certain diagnosis, or that kind of thing is not about individuals. That we can share.
Right. We can freely share that too.
Yeah. But what we can do, I mean, we work with people in the US and doing these things. And generally what we did was we agreed on the data format. We put all the Danish data in that format. And they put all the US data in that format. And then we shared our programs. And then they ran the analysis software on the US data in the US, and we ran the analysis software on the Danish data in Denmark. So, you know, we couldn't move all the data to one place, but we could move the programs to the data.
I think there's a question in the back.
So these were patients who were hospitalized in a psychiatric hospital. What was the usual duration of hospitalization?
It varies greatly, but there were many of these patients who were really long-term residents there. So many
Not
months.
a short duration of side effects that you're capturing.
No, because this is also, it's sort of an infamous psychiatric hospital. It's the one for the worst cases. So usually, if you send to that psychiatric hospital, you're not there for a short time.
Okay, well, let's thank our speaker again. Thank you very much. things turned off.